Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for participating in today's Time to Talk webinar, sponsored by the Young Lawyers and Diversity Conferences of the Virginia State Bar. My name is Mallory, and I'll be covering a few housekeeping items before turning it over to today's moderator. Comments made during this webinar are the sole expression of the speaker, not on behalf of the Virginia State Bar, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the organization. I'll now turn it over to today's moderator, the Honorable Manny Capsalis of Fairfax City General District Court.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's actually Fairfax County's General District Court, but I hope everybody's doing well. It's great to virtually see everybody here. I appreciate you attending, and I want to thank the Virginia State Bar and the Diversity Conference and the Young Lawyers Conference for organizing this. This is another in a series of town hall meetings that we're having. We look forward to spending some time with you. I'm particularly honored to be with our panelists and with the president of the bar, Mr. Buniva. And in a moment, I'm going to ask him to make some opening remarks. The topic today, and the title is Time to Talk, Explicitly Addressing Implicit Bias. And that's going to be the theme, discussing implicit bias and all its permutations and what that means now and moving forward. In a minute, I'm going to really give you a very rough and quick outline as to how we hope we're going to be able to go through the course of this discussion. And then I'm going to introduce our panelists. The first thing I want to do, though, is to thank Mallory Ralston and Sylvia Daniel from the Virginia State Bar. As always, they've done a bang-up job. Thank you very much. And I know Doris and Brian know, being presidents of the bar staff is amazing. It is incredible the work they do, and I can't say enough good things about them. They somehow made me almost look good when I was president, and I know they were invaluable in their assistance to Brian and Doris and all the other presidents of the bar. Thank you, Mallory. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, everyone at the bar, and thank you to everyone at the Young Lawyers Conference and the Diversity Conference as well. All right, let me go ahead and introduce Brian Buniva. Not that he needs any introduction, but he's the current president of the Virginia State Bar, and he is the owner and managing member of BL Buniva Strategic Advisors, PLLC. His area of practice ranges from land use development, working with federal, state, and local agencies, environmental law, corporate governance, and serving as a neutral dispute resolution advisor. Along with Doris, we've had the pleasure of serving on Bar Council for many years with Brian, and just thrilled that he's serving as the second president of the Virginia State Bar. Brian, we would love it if you could give some opening remarks. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Manny. First of all, I want to thank you for the kind introduction, but I also want to thank Sheila Costin and Chitty James, who's Sheila's the current chair, and Chitty is the immediate past chair of our diversity conference. Thank you for inviting me to offer a few observations at the outset of this webinar. Also want to mention Missy York, who's the president of the Young Lawyers Conference, who is co-sponsoring this important topic, explicitly addressing implicit bias. First, I'd like to commend the individuals who developed this webinar. This topic, in the midst of the civil unrest and culture wars that we are currently experiencing, can either be a step toward healing the pain that has been felt by many of our fellow citizens, or it can fan the flames of defensiveness, divisiveness, and prejudice that we want to see come to an end. I'm confident that with the distinguished moderator and panel that has been assembled here, this webinar will be part of a healing process. To address the issue of implicit bias, I believe we must take a look at the history of implicit bias infecting our society, and frankly, our own noble profession, which overtly subscribes to the aspiration of providing equal justice for all. The founding fathers stated, quote, that all men are created equal. But in 1787, the vote was limited to white men who owned property. It took more than 47 years later, and the slaughter of more than 800,000 Americans in a civil war before African American men were given the right to vote. It took 133 years after the adoption of our Constitution before white women could vote. And some say that African American and other minority women and men were not allowed to vote until after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted and commenced its enforcement. That's some 178 years after the adoption of our Constitution. Why did the bias in favor of white property owning men and the exclusion of all other men and women come to be, and why did it take a full 178 years to change that? Perhaps part of today's discussions will touch on these and other questions. Today in Virginia, we have several statewide bar organizations: the Voluntary Virginia Bar Association, the Voluntary Old Dominion Bar Association, and the mandatory Virginia State Bar, which I'm privileged to lead. There are at least 4 other statewide ethnocentric bar associations of more recent origin than those 3. The Virginia Women Attorneys Association, the Asia Pacific American Bar Association, the Hispanic Bar Association, and the Hill-Tucker Bar Association. They have all played a significant role in advancing diversity, inclusion, and elimination of bias in our profession. But why did folks believe that there needed to be more than one statewide bar organization? Did implicit or even explicit bias have anything to do with it? Let's look at the history of the 3 oldest statewide bar associations. The Virginia Bar Association, according to its own website, was founded in July of 1888, when more than 100 white male attorneys came from across the state and formed this first statewide bar group. They sought to raise the professional standards and improve the law. At the time, Virginia lawyers faced no standards for bar admission, no bar examination, no code of ethics, and they had no voice in judicial selection or law reform, and no means to discipline existing lawyers. So the Virginia State Bar Association, or State Bar, on its websites indicates that it was created in 1938 by an act of the Virginia General Assembly as the administrative arm of the Supreme Court of Virginia. And that unified all Virginia lawyers into a mandatory state bar. The mission of the state bar, we all know, is to protect the public, to regulate the legal profession, to improve and advance access to legal services, and to assist in improving the legal profession and judicial system. The VSB in recent years, thanks in no small measure to a past president and our current moderator today, Judge Capsalis, has worked diligently through the formation of the Diversity Conference to be more inclusive in its leadership, and with the participation of another of our panelists, Doris Causey, she became the first African-American president of the VSB during the 2017-2018 bar year. Progress has been made, and I'm confident more consistent and meaningful progress will be made in rooting out implicit bias. But as one recent commentator has observed, in order to root out implicit bias, we must attack its roots. And the roots, says this commentator, are in one degree or another inside us, or we would not innately see others as they're like us or they're not like us. Today's discussion is designed to help us look at ourselves and each other with honesty, integrity, and most importantly, with kindness to each other and to ourselves. Working together, we can rise to the challenge of addressing implicit bias and advance toward our mutual goal of providing equal justice for all. Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much. And we're so grateful for you taking time out of your schedule. Having been there, done that, I know how busy it is. I know Doris can speak to this too, being president of the bar and the time commitments for that. So we really do appreciate you being a part of this, and not only making those introductory remarks, but also really being the 4th panelist as you feel willing and able to participate. You know, this by the very nature.
No place I'd rather be.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And no place we would want you to be other than this. In talking about implicit bias, it's important to have a frank discussion about that. We need to have that. And in having that discussion, our goal is for this to be a meaningful discussion. And if so, it can be a positive discussion and a hopeful discussion. And this hopefully is a very, very small part of the effort of many to try to achieve what has been a goal of our country since its origin, which is to try to achieve a more perfect union. I think back to Dr. King's famous statement that the arc of moral justice is long, but it bends towards justice. And I believe that. And hopefully town halls like this and the efforts of many move us slowly, but move us in that direction. As a sitting judge, I'm here under the predicate of an open letter that was written by the Supreme Court of Virginia and endorsed by all the justices. And in that letter, the Supreme Court referred to and addressed the racial divide we experience in this country. And the Supreme Court called on all attorneys and all judges to take all steps possible to ensure that individuals who come before the courts of our Commonwealth are treated equally and fairly and with dignity under the law. And the court referred to this as a, quote, moral imperative, end quote. Very grateful, as are the other members of the judiciary and the bar, that the Supreme Court of Virginia, our Supreme Court, has taken the lead on this important subject. And as a result of that, some other courts, including my court, are crafting their own plans of action, their own statements, reaffirming their commitment to working with local bar associations. For example, in my neck of the woods, Fairfax Circuit Court, last month, our circuit court bench provided a unanimously signed, what they refer to as an initial plan of action. Our court put together a committee, and I'm honored to be the chair of that committee, and we're in the process of finalizing a draft of a plan of action that we hope to present as well. I believe the Juvenile Domestic Relations Court may be doing something similar. And the Fairfax Bar Association has really taken the lead. Donna Banks is the current president of the Fairfax Bar Association, and they are committed to working with our courts and with the community to try to address the issues that we're dealing with here, but also kind of in a more global sense, promoting diversity and inclusion in the legal profession and enhancing access to justice in our courts. I appreciate the lead taken by the courts, by our court, by the local and by the state bar and the local bars. And I know I, for one, very much look forward to working with our local bar association to try to achieve those very noble goals. What we're going to do today is, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to very quickly run through a very rough outline of what we hope to talk about, and then we're going to start to drill deep. First of all, I think you have to begin with defining what in the world is implicit bias. Are we naturally wired for bias? How do people become biased? Are only some people or all people biased? What does it look like? How is it manifested? What are the important realities and effects or consequences of implicit bias? And if we can possibly drill deeper, what relationship does implicit bias have with disparate treatment or impact, or procedural and substantive application of the law, with diversity, with inclusion, with equity? What, if any, role does implicit bias have with prejudice? I think we can all say that while our country has come a long way, we've got a long way to go. And hopefully we can at least touch upon some of the legal and societal advances, but in recognizing those, here in the year 2020, we're still having these discussions. How is it that we're in this situation, and how do we move forward? Are societal perceptions finally beginning to change? What's different now, if anything, than it was before? How does implicit bias fit into the overall of the general dialogue? Is it possible to de-bias or to eradicate implicit bias? How do you go about doing that? I'll be turning to Dr. Crawford shortly to talk about a clinical discussion of how to address implicit bias. How do you deal with it? How do you confront it from a clinical standpoint? and also with Doris Causey and Tammy Currie from an employment and also a legal standpoint and a societal standpoint as well. What's an equity lens? What is that? How does that play? And what are the importance of what's the importance of words? How do they matter? There is a phrase that some people judge ourselves by our intentions, but others by their impact. What does that mean? How does that fit into all this? What's the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist? But finally, and most importantly, I hope that we can reinforce a message of hope that what we can do individually and collectively to bend that arc of moral justice, or bend it towards justice, as Dr. King mentioned. Being an ally in support of diversity and inclusion and equity, and holding ourselves accountable. And diversity not just of individuals, but of ideals. And to give some examples of things that have worked with the bar and with the community and other things. With that in mind, let me go ahead and introduce, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our three panelists who really need no introduction. The first is Doris Causey. Good afternoon, Doris. And Doris, as we all know, was the 79th president of the Virginia State Bar. She was the first African-American and the first legal aid attorney to hold that office in the bar's 80-year history. She was and is the managing attorney of the Richmond office of Central Virginia Legal Aid Society, Inc. And her practice focuses on representing indigent clients in civil litigation matters. Graduated from University of Mississippi, Master's of Education from Tennessee State University, and a Juris Doctorate from Thurgood Marshall School of Law and Texas Southern University. Doris, thank you very much for being a part of this important panel.
Thank you.
And we have Tammy Currie. Tammy's the HR Director and Acting EEO Officer of Northern Virginia Community College in my neck of the woods, which is the largest college in Virginia. She focuses on building relationships and building needs, business needs, while maintaining compliance. She provides consultation and guidance to leadership on strategic initiatives, resolving discrimination claims, as well as coaching and mentoring her staff. She has worked in higher education with some fine universities, with College of William and Mary and George Washington, and my alma mater, Duke University. And she holds a bachelor's degree from Hampton University, another fine institution, and a master's degree in human resource development from the George Washington University. She's a certified affirmative action professional and a certified life coach. Tammy Currie, thank you so much for being a part of this important panel.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And last and certainly not least, all the way from Texas, I believe, is that right? Is Dr. Shannan Crawford. And Dr. Crawford is a licensed clinical psychologist, a conference speaker, an adjunct professor, and an innovator expert in restoring self-cohesion. Her life mission, according to her website and her bio, which I find very impressive, is to impact a generation by empowering individuals and organizations to identify and eliminate internal blocks that hinder them from optimally thriving and fulfilling their life purpose. She's a California native. She earned her APA accredited doctoral and master's degree in clinical psychology from Regent University. Props to Regent University, here in Virginia. And she's an adjunct professor at King's University in Texas. So Dr. Crawford, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be a part of this important conference. And let me begin with the most basic question, which is, we're talking about implicit bias. What in the world is that? What is implicit bias? We need to define that term. Dr. Crawford, let me turn to you.
Okay.
What is implicit bias and what is prejudice? Are they interrelated? What in the world are we talking about?
Sure, absolutely. So the brain has different levels of processing, and at the conscious level, you have strong schemas, which are mental frameworks that construct what you think, right? So if you ask your phone number, your address, who you are, where you live, where you're back from, all of that is conscious memory. And so that's one level, that's explicit memory. And then you have implicit memory, and that's everything that's been stored throughout your life experience. I hear students all the time say they think they have bad memories. In reality, we have phenomenal memories, pretty photographic, really. It's the recall. It's being able to draw that memory up. And so when it's an implicit memory, that means it's unconscious. And there's neural networks that are created to everything that we've ever gone through. And some of that might be through classical conditioning. You had an experience where you watched a TV program and the serial killer looked like a certain thing, or a rap song, or a teacher, or somebody, you overheard them say something. And so these biases are created. Some are good and some are really bad. And those are created at such an unconscious level that we don't even realize we have them. I hope we're at, in my circle of people, I think we're at the place where I rarely meet somebody who is overtly racist. That's pretty less common in my sphere. I can't say that for the whole world, right? But most people still have those biases, including myself, where I'll find out that I have a bias in the moment going, oh my goodness, I just had a reaction. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm prejudiced, because prejudice now means it's coming conscious and I have attitudes, behaviors, and feelings associated that I'm now holding on to as a prejudice, versus a classically conditioned association where this now has symbolic meaning to me, which is an implicit bias, which is not the same as prejudice, which is not the same as racism. So there's three different categories, almost like a spectrum, but they definitely kind of feed into one another if we're not being mindful of what our thoughts are.
Doctor, I've read that all people are naturally wired for bias. Is that an accurate statement? And
1,000%.
what does that mean?
So the way the brain works is efficiency. It's incredible the way that we're wired. And so the brain will try to automatically route things as efficiently as possible. And so the bias means the brain goes, okay, you look like this, I'm going to put you in a category, and I'm going to put everybody with a similar characteristic in that same category. And the brain likes chunking things. It's like there's these little buckets. They're actually neuro networks, but think of it like a bucket. And then everything similar now gets a sticky. And so now I'm associating this person in front of me without consciously realizing it with all my past experience, projection, stereotypes, whatever, with this person in a split second. You know, the book Blink is a great resource to recognize how instantaneous this process is, that the brain naturally leans toward bias instead of coming to every situation new. I mean, I'd have to go, computer, what is this thing, right? Person with legs, talking, language, everything would be so sluggish and obsolete if our brain was a computer having to come at every single thing as a new and novel situation. So the brain is creating all these automaticity routes so that your brain can go, oh, that's what this is, that's what that bucket is. And so then we catch it along the way going, oh my gosh, that was a bias. That wasn't a fair assumption that I made about that person. There was an example where a woman is an attorney and she was stopped by the security guard because she was African American when the other white colleagues were not stopped. And it wasn't necessarily a malicious, I'm being racist. It was more his stereotype was, oh, if you are African American in this part of the court area, then you're probably more of a client person than an actual attorney person. And so those biases come up where we're leaning in directions of automaticity. And so I think that's the value of today's conversation, is that we're taking the shame off of it, that this really is how the brain is wired, but it doesn't mean that I don't have to do the work to not work on it. It just means I understand that it's there, and now I have some tools to come against that and come at every situation and every individual with curiosity and humility.
So do we unconsciously look for patterns or things that we kind of, this may not be the right word, but internally stereotype?
Absolutely. The brain feels more comfortable when things are chunked and orderly and linear, even if reality isn't. Reality is more messy and divergent, but in the brain's way of functioning, it really likes to find patterns. So it's like, this male, well then a male hurt me in the past, so now it's these males are all bad, or female or African American or Hispanic or Asian or Caucasian, whatever the category is, the brain will naturally create these linear connections and patterns that aren't necessarily real to life, but the brain is trying to pick those up, because then it reduces our anxiety of feeling like I have too many browser windows open in my brain when I say, oh, it's this. kind of like the puppy and the horse. So kids are learning that and they go, oh, puppy. And so they call all four-legged animals puppy, even though some of them are horses and some of them are cattle and different animals. Those are natural things that we do where we chunk everything into a pattern when it doesn't necessarily belong together.
All right. Tammy and Doris, let's take that from an individual basis and talk about it in a group or in an institutional environment. What is your experience with implicit or unconscious bias, not just for individuals, but I mean, Tammy, for example, you're an HR director in a group setting. How does that work?
Well, actually, when you're looking at this from the perspective of just employment or the hiring process, oftentimes folks are not given a fair shakeout to be considered for positions because they are being scrutinized based on, as Dr. Crawford described, so many of those unconscious thoughts that they've had or experiences from their past that draw conclusions for them of, well, I don't want this candidate to make it to the final round because she lives in this neighborhood or she graduated from this school, which might be an HBCU or just not what's conducive to what that particular person is imagining is a good fit. And I say fit in quotes because it's not a word that I prefer to use because it does in its own way single out what we're trying to describe. But in that process, we're trying really hard to make sure that folks are being fair and consistent and making sure that it's important for folks to stop and think about what they're doing. So in the HR world, you try to diversify your committee so that you don't have that one mindset at the table making decisions about who will be selected for the hiring, or even, you know, in the process of employee relations, when you're having to take disciplinary action, you want to make sure that you have folks who know how to be consistent and follow policy minimally, because that, if the policies are written with fairness and equity at the forefront, then that helps us reach a fair conclusion. So people really do, in the world of employment, there are so many opportunities for folks to inject a bias mindset. And as HR, we have to ensure that those policies are in place to help them get back on track, because it's not meant to, it can be a liability for the organization, honestly.
And I certainly in a moment want to get into how to deal with it. Let me ask, and Doris certainly would welcome your thoughts as well. To all of you, is this a fair statement that similar individuals or in-group members are often rewarded while dissimilar or out-of-group members are disadvantaged? Do you find that to be true? And if so, why? How does that occur?
I'd say that that's true. It's true in so many ways, because that's how the rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to get poorer, right? You have the folks who are reaching out to their friends, folks who are in their circle, and they are providing opportunities and offers to those folks without maybe presenting an opportunity or broadening the scope of folks having an opportunity to be a part of something that they wouldn't typically be a part of. So.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Crawford, from a clinical perspective, would you agree with that statement?
I think at a macro level that the brain really likes familiarity. There's something that feels secure and safe about that, but it doesn't necessarily have to only be to skin color or neighborhood. It could be anything that draws people together. For instance, people of faith tend to kind of draw together. So it's something that would lower the boundaries of feeling like othered, of nobody knows me and I'm scared and overwhelmed. And so we all have that natural anxiety of the unknown. And so when you're gravitating towards somebody, it's usually because you found something that feels familiar, that's kind of an inroad to draw you toward them. And the brain naturally kind of reverts going, hey, I don't have a template for this. I don't know what to expect or anticipate. So I'm going to pull away from what's not familiar to me instead of leaning in. And that's where we have to consciously make the effort to lean into relationships and people and events events that are not our natural and our familiar, because then that lowers that central nervous response that goes fight or flight, something new, unexpected. And then instead now training the central nervous system, hey, I'm okay, this is a positive experience, positive people to be around, and then you can lean into those other groups that you might have been reticent to do so in the past.
Thank you. And Doris, from your perspective, with legal aid and the work you do as an attorney, do you find that implicit bias plays a role in the types of cases that your client has and the litigation of those cases and the legal needs of your clients?
Yes, as you know, because you work in the general district court, that's where 95% of all cases throughout the country really, that's where they really happen. And the most of the time when you're there, those cases are about poor people being poor. What happened? You didn't pay your rent. So there was some crime that took place. Why did this crime take place? And we know that the implicit biases are there because we see it. Sometimes you hear people talk about the unfair treatment, the judgments that occur. And I know that you know this because you're the judge. So you see a lot of times people do not come to court and there's just judgment after judgment. Judgment is sued, judgment is sued. And also you have that when you're low income, the majority of the time there's no representation. And from legal aid standpoint, there are not enough attorneys to do the work, and there are not enough attorneys to go to court with all of those people in that lower general district court, which includes the JNDR courts. As part of the general district court, there are not enough people to go to court, attorneys to go to court with them as far as the legal aid perspective is concerned, so that they can get that judgment. Statistics show that when you go to court with an attorney, especially in the work that I do, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a favorable outcome. But when you do not go without an attorney, period, and it's for one of those poverty things that we see, then almost 100% of the time you have a losing or bad outcome. So we see it in case filings. We see that fees, all late fees, all whether you have a bank account, how do you pay your rent? You totally use money orders because poor people tend to not have bank accounts. Why? They can't get a bank account. Who gives them those bank accounts, or who gives them the actual credit to have to go out and buy an apartment? We are against the landlord now, but I won't say the landlord's name. They don't consider themselves landlords. They consider themselves an organization that helps people who can't rent houses. And of course we oppose them. We don't like anything that they're doing. They like people to sign contracts instead of leases. It's very bad, but it's the system. Once you have an eviction on your record, nobody else is going to rent to you. So when we see the biases there, we see the poor people biases. We see how people treat you based on what they see, what they think, and what they have considered you to be, because you don't have this particular you don't have the income, or you do not have the funds, and that's the desperate impact that we have on them. But you can definitely see it, and most of those people are Black and brown people. So that's where we see it from a legal standpoint. And everybody in the world now is talking about what happened with Breonna Taylor, and the whole idea of if you are from a particular ethnic group, from a background, you date a drug dealer, you have a death sentence. So it's just kind of a different perspective when people see and understand your actions and feelings and your decisions that are based on what other people have perceived.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. How is it implicit bias if someone doesn't come to court and they have judgments rendered against them?
Well, I would say for this, if you have a court date on a particular day, it may take you to get to this court hearing, it may take you 5 buses to get there. Right now, we're in virtual school, we're in virtual everything. So how can that parent leave that child, catch 5 city buses to get downtown to a particular court hearing? When you go to these court hearings, sometimes I see that the majority of people are there. They when they come up as legal aid, there's this thought process that we see as legal aid attorneys that, oh, they're represented by legal aid, and that shouldn't be the case. There are fees and things that go into play when they don't come, and you say, why didn't you come to court? And it's only because I didn't have the ride. I was not able to continue my case because I didn't have an attorney. And when I see that, I understand basically from their actions and from your landlord's decisions, that's where the implicit bias has come in against you.
All right, Dr. Crawford, let's talk a little bit about, I asked you before, and you really led off with the discussion of what is implicit bias. And by the way, is implicit bias and unconscious bias the same thing, or are they actually different?
Yeah, so implicit is a different route to memory access. So
Okay.
Unconscious interchange.
All right, well, thank you. So, and you really gave a great opening discussion about defining implicit bias. But talk to us, if you would, about the realities or the effects of implicit bias or the consequences of implicit bias from a clinical standpoint for an individual. And then I'm going to turn to Tammy, Ms. Currie, and ask the same question from a group or an employment or a business standpoint. But first, Dr. Crawford, what are the realities? What are the consequences? What are the effects of implicit bias?
I think we can see it easily in healthcare, but also in psychology, where there's a greater disproportion of people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia or delusional disorders, because there's a leaning toward a bias that certain people that have certain mannerisms, behavior, lack of eye contact, beliefs that sound irrational, that is automatically a schizoaffective or schizophrenia or a delusional disorder, instead of saying, hey, is it possible there may be extensive trauma? There may be a whole background of other things that are being layered over with the presenting symptoms, instead of the deeper root to why they're having those symptoms. So it's really easy to just push that person aside, get them medicated, and not get them the therapy that really could go to maybe some of those deeper traumas, even generational. There's a term called patterns of generational transmission. So we have these patterns in our family that can go forward in our culture, in our micro culture of family and macro culture. And so people carry a lot of trauma, and it just manifests differently. In Caucasian people, it tends to be a little bit more histrionic and emotional, and kind of the borderline female is the stereotype, which is not fair either, because that would be a bias of going, oh gosh, here we go with this client, versus another client that might be more defiant, non-cooperative. And so the bias would naturally go, oh, criminality, instead of going, oh my goodness, you probably have attachment issues. Is there something in your background that now you've created a defensive posture around yourself that we're only seeing that, and I'm just kind of dismissing you and not seeing your humanity below that, and willing to go to those deeper places in therapy. Another large one is eye contact. So different cultures do eye contact differently. And so I've seen that, where if a client doesn't give eye contact, a lot of times to a different culture, that might feel disrespectful, or like you're lying, or I can't trust you, why you're not looking at me, are you not listening or paying attention, are you disrespecting me? And that can go right to a bias inside of me going, oh, you're one of those category people, instead of thinking, oh, they were probably taught to a sign of deferring to respect for others might be looking away when they're talking and then looking when they're doing the talking. So there's lots of code switching between cultures that if a psychologist doesn't know that, then people can just be quickly pushed to a side or a category or a diagnosis or a medication instead of really getting the services that that individual might need.
So how do you begin that process? Somebody, for whatever reason, comes to you, and there is at least a suspicion on some level that implicit bias may be part of what's going on. How do you make that determination? What do you do from a clinical perspective?
Well, like if they're already diagnosed and then they're coming to me?
Well, or if you were to, well, all right, let's go with that. All right, they've been diagnosed. Well, first of all, no, let's start this. How was someone diagnosed with issues relating to implicit bias? How is that determination made? Are there standardized tests? How does that work?
So it depends. The DSM is our diagnostic manual, and so you're looking for criteria that can be met. The issue is most people aren't also doing psychometric assessments, and so bias can very much influence if I think you tick off on all those criteria measures. And so a lot of people will end up going to different therapists and they just keep racking on different diagnoses instead of going, nobody's really done a thorough analysis on this person. It's just kind of people saying, oh, yep, you meet criteria for this, so we'll put that diagnosis also. For instance, anxiety, depression, trauma, repressed memories all look the exact same in presentation as ADHD. Not to say ADHD is not real, but there's a lot of children and adults being diagnosed and given medication for something they've never been psychometrically assessed for, but they meet the criteria. Oh, you're distracted, you have a hard time focusing, you tend to be disorganized, which is very similar in presentation as people who have, if you think of a computer, you have way too many browser windows open, and so the brain does get disorganized. It is hard to focus. If you're hungry, if you have abuse at home, if you are being bullied, if there's all kinds of things going on, the brain will present with similar presentation as somebody with ADHD. And that's a very common one where children are being over-medicated instead of a thorough analysis. Is this actually the presenting issue, or do they have past or present trauma or something else, a disparate issue in their life that's not being addressed?
All right, and I want to get to how to address it. Tammy Currie, talk to us, if you would, about the realities or the effects or the consequences of implicit bias from an HR standpoint, or from a group or an employment or business standpoint. What are the effects? What are the consequences of that? Why is it germane? Why is it something that needs to be focused upon?
Well, I'd say the overarching concerns or consequences include the liabilities that are created when implicit bias is inserted, especially from someone with power or authority, the opportunity for discrimination in a process where a decision has been made and you've overlooked a qualified candidate who represents a minority or a protected class, and you've chosen someone who's not as qualified. That creates an opportunity for claims of discrimination, and just the missed opportunity. There's a huge missed opportunity to diversify or to have a fuller range of talent at the table, if you will, when you are open to the folks who are qualified for a position or qualified to serve on a committee or maybe even a board, whatever the case may be. It is so important to recognize that we all add value, and we can all add similar value or bring a different value. So if you're that person who's deciding who's going to make the team, you're looking for everybody with the same mindset or that very similar thought process, then you're not likely to have as rich of a outcome as you would if you diversified, if you start looking for folks who don't look like you, don't think like you, but
are qualified and are quite capable of adding value to the conversation or to the organization if you're looking to hire that person. So, being open-minded and being able to recognize that I know enough to know that I don't know everything, and recognizing the huge benefit of just giving people an opportunity to show their capabilities in the workplace or on a committee, homeowners association, whatever the case may be. It really will open up opportunities for folks to compete. In higher education, colleges and universities are constantly competing, whether it's spoken or not. There is this need to stay relevant, and there is a need to stay to be progressive, and we do that by making sure that we know what best practices look like, and best practices consistently speak to diversifying and recognizing the need to diversify, which in my mind, if you could just maintain some level of fairness and equity in your approach to doing business, you're probably going to reach that level of diversification that would be good for everybody.
And Doris and Brian, certainly I welcome your thoughts too from a legal or a client perspective, a client application. If we all carry with us implicit biases, as an attorney, how do you avoid any implicit biases you may have in affecting your ability to represent your client? That's kind of a loaded question, but I'm the moderator, so I get to ask it.
Well, we get to ask you questions too from time to time, but we'll pass it along. The truth is that I do have implicit biases. The trick is recognizing them in time to not act on them. That's sort of my life challenge as I go along. But as I look back on my life, I think, boy, I heard a lot of things around the dinner table or elsewhere that have had an effect on how I see the world. And along the way, I've decided that some of the things that I learned I don't really like. And I don't want to continue to see the world through that lens. But when I take a legal aid case, for example, I recognize in myself that I immediately think I know where they came from. I think I know what their experiences have been and things of that nature. And I make sort of implicit judgments that when I stop that process and think about it and listen, I think for me is a key, then I start to find out, well, maybe you were right on that point, but you certainly weren't right on this point. That self-questioning process is the only way I think I can, at least, I'll just make it personal, I can improve my ability to not so much not have the bias, but to deal with it in a more constructive way than I might otherwise if I never try to understand it.
Yeah, it is, and actually, in saying that I really thought in my years of practice before I went on the bench, I learned a whole lot more from my clients than they ever learned from me, and just learning from them and their different backgrounds, disparate backgrounds, whatever it may be, and taking that to heart, I found that hopefully that helped broaden my horizons and had a better appreciation of everybody's makeup, and hopefully that in turn helped me be a better attorney. Doris, let me ask you the same question, and we have our first question from the audience that goes to past president of the bar, Doris Causey. So let me go ahead and ask that question. Yeah, a question from the audience, and the question is for Doris. Do you find that at trials, the opposing side emphasizes the bias to obtain leverage in the case?
Yes, sometimes. It just depends on what case you're in. I've had cases where you can tell that the other side is using their thoughts and what their makeup is to influence the judge and influence the case may be. You have to get the judges. Sometimes it depends on which judge it is, and which county you're in. Sorry, judge, but in which county you're in, to understand where people come from and why the situation is the way it is. There are more things that go into just a particular case. There's so much that goes into a juvenile case. There's so much that goes into a landlord-tenant case that we just don't see. There's so many layers. I think that I have taken other white attorneys with me to court because I just need a white man to stand next to me, because I know what's happening on the other side. They're using that implicit bias to get the judge, or that friendship, or we're in this particular club together. It's very difficult for you to represent people who are poor and people of different races and color, that they feel that they're being, that there's some implicit bias against them because of where they're from, what they look like, what their background is, and how they talk, what language, vernacular that they're using. It's so hard to explain to them that the court in itself is being fair to them because this, and this happened. Rules are different, and you have to, myself and people who I work with, I know we go through a long process of explaining how this worked and where this came from and how it came to be. And for me and my clients, it's difficult to help them to understand that. And I have my own implicit biases. I do. I know that I do. And I will, and when you see a certain thing happening in court, it's hard for you not to react. But you have to make sure that your reactions are reflected as well. It's good. Sometimes
How do you explain it to a client? You said just sometimes you have to explain it to a client. How do you do that?
Well, it just depends on which client I have. If it's, say, if it's a Hispanic client, I say, no, the interpreter interprets exactly what you're saying. I go outside, I go through everything. I try to explain what the law says to them as opposed to what's happening and how we got to this point. If it's an African-American client and they think the judge is prejudiced towards them, I explain to them that, hey, this is where you are versus what they think that you should be doing. And this is why it happened. I understand this part over here, but you have to see this. You didn't do this, this, and this, and you have to do it in this order. Sometimes it's about jumping through hoops to get to where you need to be, and that's difficult. People who say, well, Doris, how did you become president? Because look at all the people before you. Yes, you jumped through the hoops. I mean, but I jumped through the same hoops that you and Brian jumped through. We all decided to be on bar council. We all were on the executive committee. Then we all did this. But we knew that process. If you do not have the educational level, or you don't have the experience in going to court, you are afraid and you don't know, especially if you walk into a courthouse where there are no judges that look like you. And people think that if you see a judge that doesn't look like you, then that judge doesn't understand you. And so you have to explain to your clients that they're here to follow the rule of law. And this is what the law is. And you go through that constantly with your clients so that they can understand. And if they have any questions, you answer those questions to the best of your ability. And they still think that that the person is being prejudiced, then you just have to explain. I mean, I've been asked not to sit on the front. Only attorneys sit here. And I go, okay. And I sit down. And they still give you, the deputy comes over and says, excuse me. I said, this is for attorneys. And I said, okay, I know. And I sit there. And, you know, yes, I've been asked for my bar card before. But those are things that I can either react or I can just say, okay, I understand that you were raised different. You're different. And this is how, this is what you'll normally see. like Dr. Crawford said, it may be intentional or unintentional. Most of the time, if you're Black, you think it's intentional, period. We're not thinking that your idea is unintentional. So I explain to my clients that what is happening is truly unintentional. Or I say, oh, I know Judge Capsalis, he's very nice. Don't worry about it. He didn't mean anything by it whatsoever. Believe you me, I hang out with him sometimes. I know his wife, family, and kids. So that makes them a little more at ease, because if you're a great lawyer, you know the judge.
Okay. I'm going to leave it at that. All right. Brian, anything you want to add to that without using me as an example?
Now, how could you possibly top that?
No, I don't think we can. That's why I love Doris. Let me ask, maybe this is an incredibly obvious question, maybe not. Dr. Crawford, what role does implicit bias have in understanding the concept of prejudice? Is it a root cause of prejudice? Is it on a parallel track? Is it a form of prejudice?
So that's getting into a lot of philosophical stuff that might be above my pay grade, but I would say in the way that I conceptualize it, there is a
It's
linear.
a rhetorical question. I don't know.
And there's a lot of debate. I don't think everybody, probably even among us, would agree with the same, just saying from a clinical brain perspective, that having neural networks, bias is natural. That's how the brain functions and works. And then when we create prejudice, now there's emotion, there's thoughts, and there's potential for actions that are biased toward a certain group of individuals or of any category, and it can go any direction. So when that becomes now more of a formal prejudice, I picture it like there's now a stronghold in my heart. That now I have a bias that's creating filters with more emotion, thought, and action that's implied versus, oh, whoops, I just told her to sit in the wrong spot and that was my mistake and I'm so sorry. The bias I think of as more automaticity, kind of like the autofill function in your computer, that there's an autofill function where you go, oh my gosh, person walking toward me, am I safe? And you just automatically have that reaction. But when your brain catches it, you go, whoa, that's not this person, that's not fair, brain, have a new reaction. Different than prejudice, where I think of it more like now you've actually created a stronghold on the inside. And when there's a stronghold, now I have many networks that are filtering reality. So for instance, none of us can put reality in the organ of the brain. That would cause brain damage, right? So everything comes in as sensory input and it's being filtered. It crosses over the corpus callosum. It gets filtered in the thalamus, kind of like the 1950s, the ladies that would be like, I'm routing your call. So all the information gets routed. And when I have a prejudice, now there's a very strong network that is set up against that, where I'm strongly filtering what they're doing through that network. And so that's where we start mind reading, where Doris just said, there's a tendency to think if it's a white person's doing it, I'm not going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to think that they're doing it on purpose because I have a really strong lens there. The same can happen with white people, Hispanic people, Asian people, Native American, whomever. We all do it, where we create this prejudice, and now that's filtering my perception of reality. And especially if you have emotion attached, the amygdala and the hippocampus are sitting right next to the thalamus. Thalamus is the relay station. Amygdala is all that emotional baggage that filters our perception of reality. And then hippocampus is my past experience that filters reality. And so it's all very emotionally bound when it's now prejudice versus just a natural bias to want to hang out with this group versus this group, but it's not out of a malicious or a negative filter. So that's how I kind of conceptualize those differently.
Okay, all right, well, thank you. I'm looking at a question that has been raised, and this is for Tammy. All right, so Ms. Currie, and I'll just read it. It's a quote from Steve Jobs. A lot of people in our industry haven't had very diverse experiences, so they don't have enough dots to connect, and they end up with very linear solutions without a broad perspective on the problem. The broader one's understanding of the human experience, the better design we will have. That's the quote. Therefore, broader perspective results in better outcome and solutions. Is limiting diversity, therefore limiting solutions? So that's the ultimate question.
I would say that limiting diversity is limiting opportunities. It's the solution, you may end up with a similar solution with or without diversity, but you certainly will increase exponentially the opportunity or the chances of getting a better solution, because you're broadening the scope. You're casting a wider net, so to speak. So you're considering much more in terms of knowledge, information, or folks, if that's what we're discussing, than you would had you limited yourself to just that small group that wasn't diverse and was more controlled by how you saw this population playing out. So I would say we definitely should think of diversity as just that opportunity to stay relevant and to stay in the game, so to speak, because you really do miss an opportunity if you don't consider the need to have a diverse group of people at the table.
You know, I hear it said often, and I probably said it myself, that we've come a long way in our nation's history, but we've got a long way to go. Mm-hmm. And at least from a legal or societal standpoint, there certainly have been advances in the history of our country. You know, outlawing slavery, expanding citizenship. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, others, equal protection and due process laws, case laws, Brown versus Board of Education and others, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 1968. Then you look at the Kerner Report, 1968, and it's now 2020, and here we are having this discussion. So here's the question. Are societal perceptions beginning to change? What's different now than in the past? And that's a very open-ended question. I realize that. But, you know, with all that we've gone through, with all the enactments, the amendments, the case law, the history of our country, in 2020, we're still having this conversation. Are social or societal perceptions beginning to change? I'll throw that out for discussion.
I'll take a shot.
Brian?
I'll take a shot at that. Yeah, I think that they are, but the changes are pretty much, in my experience, incremental. The watchword 10 years ago, perhaps, was diversity. And what did diversity mean? Well, to me, what it meant was you had people in the room that didn't all look like me. So we had other ethnic backgrounds, perhaps, other religious views, whatever that might be. Now, I think the word is inclusive. And in our preparation for this webinar, somebody said, and I don't know who it was, I think it was Tammy, said, diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusiveness is being asked to dance. That is being encouraged to actively participate, to not allowed to just sit there, but to say, lean in, tell me what it is. Why is your perspective different? What makes it different? What is your perspective? And I think that in the events of just the past few months, with all the civil unrest that we've experienced. Now, we've experienced civil unrest before. We had that's what the Kerner Commission was trying to figure out back in 1968. But this period of civil unrest strikes me as a little bit different. It strikes me as perhaps it's because of video cameras. You know, we now actually can see what the fuss is all about, if you will. And I don't mean to minimize by using the word fuss, but what is that all about? Well, we saw several people of a different race from me being killed who were unarmed. And it's not just Black people that are upset by that. most people are getting upset by that. Now, what we do with that, I think, is a very serious question. We can either go forward and create the Great Divide, which in an election year seems to be happening, or we can say, why did this happen this way? What is it that we can do about this? Now, that's a pretty extreme measure, but I do think that I am seeing people starting to look at this question, not with, oh my goodness, here we go again, the same we've been talking about this forever, but actually hearing, perhaps for the first time, in a very fundamental and serious way.
Well, and let me ask Dr. Crawford, does implicit bias fit into that dialogue? Does it need to be part of that dialogue?
That's all I got.
I mean, Dr. Crawford, I'm not really sure if implicit bias was a term that was tossed around years ago. Maybe it was, but it seems to me that to have that dialogue, to have that conversation today, doesn't implicit bias need to be part of that conversation? And if so, why and how?
Yes. So I think the first leg or the first chapter of diversity work was really trying to change at the conscious level. So kind of like if you were a computer, it'd be your software. And so it was trying to update. And I think there was a lot of resistance to that, especially people saying, oh, I'm not racist. And so there was a lot of pushback. And so with that pushback, then people became more like, if you're this race, then you're racist and blah, blah, blah. And so there was a lot of people that actually entrenched further in their negative bias, and they learned on the outside to not have that behavior of discrimination. They behaved themselves on the outside, but the heart wasn't changing. And so we've had conversation, and I think one of the reasons we haven't seen transformation yet is because we know the things that we're supposed to edit and say and not say as a majority. I mean, there's definitely outliers out there, but as a culture, I think most people know you're not supposed to do certain things, but that doesn't mean that we focus on the heart. And so I think the next chapter or the next leg of the race is now saying, hey, let's humble ourselves, look at our own biases, look at our own framework and past experience. And just to be vulnerable in my own story, I worked in diversity work in my undergrad, and I did multicultural as a student government. And I had really negative experiences where, as an outsider, a white person coming into groups, they were like, what do you want? Why are you here? Blah, blah, blah. And at the time, I thought, I'm an ally, I'm here to help, blah, blah. And it was later that I had emotional reactions to certain groups. And I was like, what is this about? That's not my heart. This is opposite of everything I'm called to do in life. Why am I having this reaction? And in processing and journaling and praying about it, I realized when I went through that, at the time, I thought, I'm an ally, I'm okay, that's not affecting me. It actually did hurt my feelings, and it created some bias and maybe even some hurt spots that my emotions were now causing me to react differently to people in a future situation, and they didn't deserve that based on what people in the past had done. And so I think it's more at that nuanced, fine level where we're now asking people with gentleness, with compassion, with kindness, to open up those places inside where that's the implicit or the unconscious, where everything we go through gets stored and we don't realize how much it's impacting us at the moment. But then going, why did I just have that reaction? And doing our own self-work, rather than, I think there's been a real push to kind of throw it down people's throat, and it was done in an aggressive way at some points, instead of at a gentle way that removes the shame and says, hey, we're all in the boat together. We all want, hopefully, we all want reconciliation, we want unity, we want mutual recognition, and so we need to be able to do it at that softer mutual recognition level, rather than just at a head knowledge and information and diversity training level, but really going deeper to the root issues.
Well, and that really leads beautifully into the next question we have and what I wanted to get into, which is debiasing, if that's a word, or minimizing, eradicating implicit bias even possible? And that's a segue itself to the next question we have from the audience, which is, and I'll read it. One theme from the discussion so far is 1, recognizing our implicit bias, and 2, changing our thoughts / behavior accordingly. How do you teach yourself and help others to take steps in an increasingly polarized atmosphere. It takes some personal responsibility to break out of implicit bias when it's more comfortable to resort to confirmation bias. So, Dr. Crawford, let me turn to you and ask you that, and then let me turn to Tammy Currie to talk about that from an employment or HR standpoint, and then Doris and Brian, of course, as far as a legal or client or professional standpoint. So, Dr. Crawford, you first.
Can you narrow it just a tiny bit so I make sure I'm answering the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm not doing my confirmation bias of what I think they asked.
Well, the question was, how do you teach yourself and help others to take those steps in an increasingly polarized atmosphere? That was the first question. The second question was more of a statement. It takes some personal responsibility to break out of implicit bias when it's more comfortable to resort to confirmation bias. I guess the question is, how do you break out of? How do you learn to be able to take that hard, tough look in the mirror, to honestly look at yourself, and to learn to break out of that bias, to de-bias or to minimize or eradicate the implicit bias?
So first, we do have to make it conscious. So that would be the mindful piece of recognizing when I'm having a reaction, and then laying down any permission to have that. And that's one of the hardest things I deal with people, is they will always give you an example. Yeah, but this event happened, so I am justified because they did do this to me. This event is real. The event is real, but now I'm responsible for the residue I allow and the filters that I maintain inside of me. So when I realize my own filters, emotions, prejudice, reactions, even discrimination that might come out of me, instead of, oh, well, it was deserved, blah, 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 really taking the time with humility and curiosity to say, I need to process this and start figuring out any of the tender spots inside of me that might be triggered by a person, a situation, or when I feel out of control or outnumbered or overwhelmed or unsafe. Any of those biases can activate old triggers. And a lot of us have life events, small t triggers, small t traumas that affect us. And then that continues to kind of lump in life experiences because of self-fulfilling prophecies. If I walk into a party and my arms are closed and I've got this kind of body language, people are going to respond to me the way I think they are. So then that continues to keep me in that posture of the confirmation bias. Well, see, I knew all X people are like this. And then I stay in that place where I'm confirming my own bias and I'm replicating situational dynamics at an unconscious level that keep confirming what I already believe. Versus stepping outside of that, not giving myself permission to walk away with core beliefs just because of situational variables, but saying, I'm the steward of my heart. I'm not allowed to have weeds that stay there. So when I realize that, that's now incumbent on me to process that, to process it with safe people. I have a good circle of friends that I'll be like, hey, like, help me navigate this because I had an emotional reaction and I may not consciously understand it, or I'll pray about it and I'll journal and process it so that now I'm creating a new classically conditioned association to that event or situation, that now there's closure rather than a minimized browser window where something's hanging out down here that's kind of affecting me at a subconscious level. But now it's like, okay, I'm maximizing that browser window. I'm doing due diligence to clean it out, resolve it, reject the lie, the core belief I might have believed or judgment. And now I'm going to believe a new core belief and create new neural networks around that and surround myself with positive people and events of that same category. So now I have a strong, robust neural network that is on the positive side of that exact thing that there was a negative prior.
Yeah, and you know, it just made me realize that, and I certainly saw this as an attorney, Doris, and Brian, you may have seen this as well, that sometimes eyewitness testimony can be the most unreliable. You can have 10 people witnessing something, and you're going to get 10 different versions of something. And the question is, well, why? Well, because it's a filter, maybe it's a bias, whatever. So it's their perception of what they're seeing, and you think, well, they all saw the same thing. They should be able to see that the light was red or the car was blue or whatever. But sometimes, Doris and Brian, I'm sure you can back me up on this, that sometimes that testimony is not necessarily reliable, even though you would think it would be because it's eyewitness testimony. And I would assume, doctor, that kind of, in a very simplistic way, weaves into what you were saying, that you're kind of filtering it. Your brain is filtering it. So what you're relaying is what you saw, but filtered with whatever preconceptions or stereotypes or biases that you have. Doesn't make you prejudicial. It's just that's the way you're wired, and that's the way you see that. This is a good segue, and Tammy, Currie, let me turn to you. How do you address this? And really, I want to get to what I said before, which is a message of hope. And this is where I want to turn this into something positive in the takeaway here, which is from an HR or employment business perspective. How do you confront this? How do you try to minimize, if not eradicate, implicit bias to try to maximize the value and the opportunities and the worth of everyone who is in your organization?
I would say that yes, I would say you would start with establishing some guiding principles. It's important to understand that when you're hoping to get folks to have an open mind, that open mind may need some amount of mentoring and coaching. So it's always, in my experience, it's always helpful to have someone mentor you through the process and recognize the differences amongst the generations and how you can learn from each other. Like you mentioned earlier, you've learned a lot from your clients that they maybe don't even know you learned. But I also would say that helping folks understand the need to be aware. Self-awareness it's a huge opportunity for us to get on the right path. And, sometimes it takes someone else to tell us, I have children, adult children, but they're quick to tell me, that wasn't right. You shouldn't have said that. And I'm thinking, was it really? Don't I have the right to say whatever I want to say after 50? But the reality is maybe not really, because I'm saying it just to them, and I'm not saying it to cause anybody any harm. But if I carry that behavior outside of my home or to a place where I'm making a decision that impacts other people, it could be damaging, and it could be damaging for a long term. So recognizing who you are and where you have opportunities to improve, like improving your level of emotional intelligence so that you can appreciate what the next person's feelings, how the next person feels. That'll make your conscience start to be your guide, and using that as another guiding principle would absolutely add value to us eradicating, or at least getting to a place where we have a limited amount of implicit bias. I would say that making your decisions and trying to run it, recognizing that the decisions that you're making are decisions that a reasonable person would make. You may have to run it by your colleague or what have you, but just making sure that you're not being so strong-minded or strong-willed that this is the decision I want to make. I want to hire Bob because I know Bob is going to do a great job because he golfs with me and he is the best one out there on the golf course, really. But that's not the idea behind decision making in the workplace, especially. You do need to have a set of policies and guidelines to help you get to a closing point, or a point of making decisions that are fair, decisions that are consistent. And finally, put yourself in that person's shoes. Doing this role play of, with just talking to yourself and asking yourself, how would I feel? I do this now. If I'm talking to employees who are being disciplined or who have issues, I may have immediate thoughts about how we got here and what the result ought to be. But when I get in that space, and Dr. Crawford mentioned, alluded to her spirituality, and I want to make sure that I don't go too far with this, but I do have to sit back and just have a little quiet time to make sure that whatever comes out of your mouth needs to be thoughtful, and it doesn't need to be hurtful, and it needs to give consideration to, we don't ever know what other people go through. So you get to that space and you're having, I just probably today or not that long ago had conversations, and I've judged the person enough to say, this is ridiculous. Why are you wasting our time? Why are we going through this? Because I see that their actions are truly going against us being productive. You're trying to manipulate the system, but the longer you listen, the longer you give them an opportunity to speak, the more you start to humble yourself and recognize this is a human being. And this human being does deserve, like any other human being, an opportunity to equal treatment. And equal treatment comes with us being open-minded. So, you know, individually, we should put emphasis on just making sure that our own awareness is constantly being evaluated or calibrated, I should say. And that as we move forward, if we're seasoned and are able to offer guidance to folks who are coming into the workforce, allow them to understand the value in gaining insight from those who have had some lessons. Like Brian mentioned earlier, he's heard conversations at the dinner table that he didn't like, he didn't want to continue with, and we have to break those cycles. So how do you break those cycles? People who have broken those cycles for themselves, they can help the next generation break those cycles. And in the workplace, just in general, making sure that those guiding principles include adhering, if you're in an organization, making sure that you're doing right by that organization, that you're following the policies and the standards of conduct, and that you subscribe to the mission and the values that have been established. That will absolutely push us in the right direction. So making sure that leadership is making sure that leadership actually demonstrates that level of commitment is a first step in any organization.
Yeah, and I agree. And there's the old adage that success or failure begins at the top, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But it really, success or failure is also dependent on everybody who's in the organization.
Yeah.
And everyone being staying true to the mission, whatever that may be. Doris and everybody else, what does it mean to be an ally? Yes. Yeah, Brian? Brian, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, in terms of the message of hope, to me, the message of hope is the becoming more aware or more awake, if you will, and taking personal responsibility. And I'll illustrate that with a short story. I was working in the corporate world for a while, and I had a very hard-charging boss who said to me, listen, if I go off the deep end or yell at you or raise my voice or insulting, please don't ever take anything I say personally. And I just sat there for a second and I said, so you're asking me not to forgive your not being responsible for what comes out of your mouth? Is that what you want? Now, I was older than he was, which probably helped that I could say that and had a pretty successful career in private practice. But it stopped him dead in his tracks. And he said, well, I don't mean to make it personal. I said, if you insult me, you're making it personal. And so I need to be responsible for what I say to you. You need to be responsible for what you say to me. Now, I don't work for them anymore. Now, perhaps that's why. But the message of hope is to take responsibility for what comes out of your mouth. You can't necessarily be responsible for what pops into your brain, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
You react to something, but not being so quick to act on that reaction or that information that pops into your brain and process it and decide how you're going to, am I going to turn this into an overt prejudice and prejudge somebody and be prejudiced because of this innate implicit instinct that I have? Or am I going to say, no, that's not right, and that's not what I need to say here and to solve this situation?
Yeah, but I'm going to turn to Doris, but also the positive negative thing that, while a negative thought may pop into your head, forcing yourself to turn around and a positive. If you see a particular person in a certain situation where you implicitly may have a negative connotation, stopping yourself and having a positive connotation instead, and in time, maybe retraining or rewiring your brain so that you're not just stereotyping or assuming this person who fits in this category, is not good for this reason because that's the way I've always thought it would be. Doris, let's talk to the young attorneys. And both as the present with the Young Lawyers Conference and future leaders of the bar, and Brian too, and really everybody. What have we found that has worked in trying to promote diversity, trying to promote inclusion, and trying to promote equity in the legal profession and in the judiciary? And I'm thinking about not just you being the first legal aid attorney to be president of the bar, the first African American to be president of the bar, but also programs. What can we do to make this a more perfect union? I'm thinking about pipeline programs, mentoring that Tammy talked about, community involvement, bar involvement. What have you found works? What do you think we should be doing or we can do better to create the more perfect union, the more inclusive, the more diverse, the more equitable profession and society that we all hope to achieve?
Well, as far as lawyers are concerned, as far as the bar is concerned, to young lawyers, I always encourage young lawyers to get involved, and I tell them to be the change that they want to see. That I also, Black people have been doing it for a long time. We adapt. When we go in a room and nobody's there that looks like us, you can either stay to yourself or you can have a good time. And then those of you who know me, I'm going to have a good time because my mother taught me a long time ago when I came home telling her that I hate somebody or I don't like a particular race of people or I think that I was treated unfairly. She would teach me, and she told me, she said, you can't change people. You have to accept them for who they are. And for those young people that are out there, if you see something, say something. If you want to do something, be like Mahatma Gandhi, be that change you want to see in the world. Get to know people. Don't just take them as what you see. I know sometimes we like to judge the book by its cover, but not all the time that's the way things are. So I think that when you try to think sometimes, because sometimes things come out of my mouth, I don't always think, but I try to say, use the word think. You have to be thoughtful, helpful, informative, needed, kind. That's just what think means. And so sometimes you see people in a room, they're off to themselves and they're not socializing or they're not being involved. Maybe you want to go over there and talk to them, because not all the time do I want to talk to Brian. I may, go, I was like, I'm not talking to Brian. I've talked to him 12 times already this year. So I go over and talk to the young people. I try to get them involved. I think that action is the key. Maybe the bar needs to come up with a DINE committee to make sure that, or take a closer look inside to say, hey, how many people, diverse people we have on this committee? How does this work? How many people do we want to see in the future do this? Ask the young lawyers to, what do they want to see? Is there a different type of programming that they want us to, or us and them to put on? I like to work with the senior lawyers because they're so much fun and they're funny. And we have a great time and they teach me a lot. And for the young lawyers, I think we could do the same. We teach them a lot about how we can make this different, how you can, what do you want to do? What do you want to see? For the person who asked the question, like, how do you do this? You just do it. There's no other way. You just get in there and you do it. That's what you do. Unfortunately, it is going to get you out of your comfort zone. it is going to bring you in some ways in confrontation with some people that you are just going to have that conversation and say, hey, that wasn't right. I didn't particularly like it, but it doesn't mean that we're not friends. But no, you can't do that. But you have to, and that's the way you move forward. You've got to make that action. You got to put that hope there. You have to start saying, hey, every committee has a young person. Every committee has somebody that's young or old, young and old, because we have the senior lawyers and we have the young lawyers, and you include some diversity there. I think that we have to, like she said, you really have to put those principles and values and things in there in order to make sure that things work. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to repeat some things, and that's not a good idea.
Oh, I agree. And, I think that, and we're going to be wrapping up here in a minute, that, part of it is embracing our differences rather than shunning them, and really accepting the concept, which I would hope would be self-evident, that our differences make us stronger together. It doesn't mean that I stop being who I am. I stop looking like who I am. I am me, and you are you. But embracing our differences rather than shunning them, we're better and we're stronger together. And also, I think, just to wrap up and build on what Doris was saying before, also paying forward and reaching out to the youth. And it's so much fun with pipeline projects and mentoring. Hill Tucker Institute, and I mean, those really are the future leaders of tomorrow. And for them to see someone like Doris Causey or Brian or even me, to spend time with them. First of all, it's fun. We love it. And secondly, their first interaction with the legal system or with a judge or attorney, whoever, is in that setting, and it's not a confrontational setting. And I think this is pretty cool. Now I want to be a lawyer, or I want to be a judge. I met the president of the bar, Ms. Causey. That is so cool. And I want to do that. And I would think that, on some level, you do it person by person, and that can help strike down that implicit bias and that whatever may be structural there, so that it really helps us achieve what's in the preamble to the rules of professional conduct, which is the best definition I've ever seen of what a lawyer is. And it really talks about not just representing your clients, but being a citizen lawyer, the obligations and the opportunities you have to the community, to be a leader of the community, to make a difference. Like Jackie Robinson said on his epitaph, life is not important except for the impact you have on other lives. It is so true. And we've run out of time, but let me just finalize with this. Let me thank each of our panelists. I am so honored to be able to spend time with each of you. Brian, that you've taken time out of your schedule as president of the bar to do this. I want to thank the Diversity Conference. I want to thank the Young Lawyers Conference. I want to mention that the public comment period is still open until, I believe, October the 2nd for a matter that's going to be coming before Bar Council, which is whether or not implicit bias should be approved as a topic for MCLE credit. I cannot take a position on that other than to tell you that if you have an opinion, if you have a voice, you're within the public comment period, and let your voice be heard on that. This is a topic that we can talk about for days, and I wish we had that, and I think we've only scratched the surface. But I think it's important to have these conversations, and it's important to try to learn to look ourselves in the mirror to see, can we do better? And, to think that when the world is e pluribus unum, out of many, one, because that's really what it should come down to. So I want to thank Doris Causey. I want to thank Tammy Currie. I want to thank Dr. Shannan Crawford. I want to thank Brian Buniva, and I want to thank everybody who attended and listened to us. From my perspective, thank you for the honor of being able to spend time with each of you. I look forward to the opportunity of doing it again. So everybody be safe out there. Hope to see you in person sometime soon. And Mallory, is there anything else we need to do to wrap up?
Y'all are fantastic. Thank you all so much for being here today. And you may exit at your leisure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be safe.
Take care.
Thank you.
God bless you all.